They thought of him as a model son.
He really was the last person you would associate with something like this.
They stayed at one of the better hotels in New York and had a very expensive holiday. It was clear now that money was no object to Brian.
On Sunday, July the 25th, 2004, in a quiet suburb of Liverpool, public schoolboy Brian Blackwell kills his parents in an horrific attack at their home. Brian Blackwell then leaves the bodies where they'd been killed and takes his girlfriend on a holiday of a lifetime to America. What amazing web of lies did this young boy create that ultimately led him to take the lives of his doting parents so brutally and then act as if nothing had happened? This is the story of how a brilliant teenage student became a killer, including for the first time his chilling confession to the killings.
And I struck him with the soft side of the hammer. I'm not sure who exactly I've struck, where, how many times. I couldn't believe that someone would have died so easily.
Brian Sr. met his future wife Jacqueline in the late 1960s, when they both worked as buyers for Littlewood stores in Liverpool. They married 20 years later, after both had divorced from their previous marriages and after the birth of their son, Brian.
Brian was the only child of Mr. and Mrs. Blackwell, although Brian's father had two much older children from a previous marriage. They lived in a nice, quiet village area of, just outside Melling, which is near towards Lancashire area. He was a very bright child, very nice child by all accounts, and widely thought of by friends of Mr. and Mrs. Blackwell as a very nice, pleasant, polite, bright young man. They thought of him as a model son.
Brian was a very good student, very able. He worked hard, particularly good at languages and sciences, and was very keen to become a doctor. So I think right the way through his time with us, he was with us from year 8, Brian was regarded as one of our high flyers, as it were.
Brian's success at school led his parents to give him the nickname Brains. But the perfect family image was beginning to crack as Brian started to clash with his parents.
His parents seemed to approve of Brian having friends more akin to their age rather than his own age. They liked him going to the tennis club and playing tennis, but they weren't so keen on him going out or hanging around with children of his own generation. There was one occasion when Brian had been accepted to both Edinburgh and Nottingham universities to go and study medicine. He wanted to go to Nottingham, but his mum and dad wanted him to go to Edinburgh because it was a city that they preferred. And there's evidence that Mr. Blackwell telephoned the admissions officer at Edinburgh University and changed Brian's place.
There's no doubt that his parents, and his mother in particular, were ambitious for him. Jackie was very proud of her son. She wanted him to do very, very well. It may well have been that there was a lot of pressure on Brian to do well, but he seemed to cope with that pressure. Most of the friends at school spoke of Brian as being a little bit cocky, plainly an extrovert, and given on many occasions to telling lies. And those lies became more elaborate as he grew older.
Brian Blackwell was beginning to build a fantasy life for himself, which would centre around his ability as a tennis player.
He was what I would call a very good schoolboy player. At Liverpool College, he was one of our best players, captained the boys' tennis team, but certainly, as far as I was aware at least, had no pretensions to be anything more than that. He certainly wasn't a top county player or somebody who was going to make his name on the professional circuit at any stage.
Brian Blackwell, by common consent, was a good club standard tennis player, but in his own mind he believed he was far better than that. He believed that he was an international level player. He believed that he could make a career from playing tennis.
He actually was given a sponsorship by a tennis sports firm, but it's their lowest form of sponsorship, where in actual fact he's able to buy rackets and equipment at a discounted price. It's certainly the lowest sponsorship they offer. Brian, on the other hand, was claiming that in actual fact he was being fairly well sponsored by leading sports firms like Nike, for example, and that he was actually being sponsored to travel to international events. We later found, in actual fact, he'd actually doctored one of the tennis magazine's charts of the young player standings, which put himself at #1, when in actual fact he appeared in none of the standings. But that was mainly to impress his girlfriend, Amal.
17-year-old Amal Saber was a fellow student at Liverpool College. She lived with her divorced mother, a doctor, and her sister in Childwall, South Liverpool. Amal and Brian became friends after meeting at school in 2001. Over 3 years, the relationship developed, and the two became very close, as she told newspaper journalist Danny Brooke.
To me, she seemed innocent, as opposed to simply naive, but there's something very sweet and very vulnerable about her.
Brian and Amal met each other at school. They wanted to go on and do the same things. They were studying similar subjects. They wanted both to go on to Nottingham to read medicine.
Their friendship was very much based on an intellectual communication. I think they talked a lot about their dreams and aspirations for their future life.
Brian seemed to want to impress her that above and beyond his intellectual capabilities, that he was also an extremely capable sports person who was going to be extremely wealthy in a very short period of time through sponsorships, and that this lifestyle that he'd invented for himself developed mainly, I think, at that point to impress Amal.
Her close friends did question Brian's stories quite a lot. It was because of their questions that she went on the internet trying to find out where he was seated, and it was because of their questions that obviously somewhere in the back of her mind she must also have had niggling doubts. But because he'd overwhelmed her, I mean, she describes it as being spellbound, she didn't take it far enough to actually confront him.
Amal Saber was getting caught up in the fantasy life Brian Blackwell had created as a successful tennis player, and he was prepared to do whatever was necessary to maintain the deceit, regardless of the cost.
I don't think that Brian was an ordinary boyfriend. He always had ideas above his station. He always seemed to feel that he should knock her for six with some fantastic present. He bought her jewellery, quite sophisticated, or apparently sophisticated, glamorous jewellery, which her mother was very suspicious about. And rather to Amal's embarrassment, I think, in front of him, asked Brian for the receipts for the jewellery, saying that she wanted to have it insured. And he never came up with the receipts.
He was. For someone of such tender years, his ability not only to tell those lies, but to perpetuate them. And certainly in the case of Amal, she could see what she thought was physical evidence of the lifestyle that he pretended he was about to enjoy. The biggest deception he sought to practice upon her was to say that he could get her a position as his PA. He told her that the contract would enable her to get something in the order of £80,000 as his PA.
He went at one stage even further, and that was to write her a cheque for £39,000, but of course he didn't have the means to cash that cheque.
The cheque bounced, and he had to lie his way out of that as well.
When Brian told Amal that he had got this big deal contract with Nike because of his new role as up-and-coming junior tennis player for his country, that it was suitable for him to have a flat in the same road as football players and to have a Mercedes outside, and she believed it completely. He never took her there because it didn't exist. It put her in a state of mind where she could be under his spell, because not all teenagers today would fall for it, but she fell hook, line and sinker.
Brian Blackwell took Amal on a tour of the most expensive car showrooms in Liverpool, claiming he needed a car that would fit his status as a successful tennis player, even though he couldn't drive. But when Amal said she'd quite like a car herself, it was another opportunity for Brian to show off his fabricated wealth.
He took her along to a dealer's in South Liverpool and made arrangements to purchase a Ford car.
He could tell these untruths, he could suggest these fantasies. He was able to back up the fantasies with a degree of reality. So he could tell Amal, I'm a successful tennis player, I have enough money to buy you a car because I have a contract and sponsorship to do so. And when the car arrived, who was Amal to think that Brian wasn't telling the truth?
The difficulty was that he didn't have the money for that. And in fact, he had to use money from a fixed-rate bond, I think it was, that his parents had set up in order to fund his education. It didn't take long for Jackie Blackwell to realise what had happened.
It was probably the first time that his parents had got onto Brian's spending habits. It was a substantial amount of money that he'd withdrawn from accounts held in his name, but very much in trust for his university education. And it was as close as Brian came to being confronted about his lifestyle. He was able to, if you like, smooth over this event with his parents, but clearly it caused them some concerns and I think alerted them to Brian's spending habits, probably for the first time.
Spring 2004. The fantasy life teenager Brian Blackwell has created as a successful international tennis player is starting to spin out of control. His spending is being questioned by his concerned parents, but he's determined to go to any lengths to impress girlfriend Amal.
He was extremely convincing, and he would supplement it with documentation that he, in many cases, had completely forged to support the idea that he was being heavily sponsored by Nike. He was also very careful as well to remember what he had said and what told Amal. And we later discovered some notes that he'd made of his conversations with her, where he was clearly making sure that he recalled what he'd said on previous conversations, because, as I say, to be a good liar, you have to have a good memory. So he was clearly keeping track of what he said, but he would produce documentation and to what, in all intents and purposes, was a fairly impressionable young girl who was dazzled, I think, by the lifestyle that Brian could possibly offer her.
I think it's fair to say that he took it as far as he possibly could, to the extent of, on one occasion, he presented himself at a bank in South Liverpool. He told the bank manager or the assistant that, in fact, he was a professional tennis player, and he named the particular tennis centre. He indicated he was in receipt of a salary of some £45,000, that, in fact, he needed access to funds because his father had died, which at that stage was patently untrue.
The financial planning of the Blackwells had been such that money was dispersed across a number of savings and bank accounts. They had saved quite heavily for his university education. He started to draw on credit cards. He'd taken credit cards out in the name of his mother, credit cards out in the name of his father, and he was using those a lot. But of course that only had a fairly short period of time before Mrs. Blackwell, who was chiefly responsible for the family finances, was to find out. And when they found out that he actually had been drawing money from other accounts, Mrs. Blackwell was extremely upset. It was their investment in him and his future, and she was concerned, and she confronted Brian. In fact, she went to the bank at one time to say that he had made application for a credit card, and that the application form was untrue, and had the credit application withdrawn. But it didn't seem to stop Brian. He simply went and applied for another card, some in the name of his parents.
Brian Blackwell was becoming more and more adventurous in his lies. He told Amal he was going to play in a tennis tournament in Milan at the end of May 2004 and asked if she'd like to go with him.
At the last moment, he said she couldn't. They wouldn't allow the players to take girlfriends, or he couldn't afford it, or whatever it was. So she was left behind, rather to her annoyance, I think. And he disappeared from school for 3 days. Then she got a text from him saying, I'm just about to go on court, wish me luck, I've just met Roger Federer. And so she was completely convinced. It was another little sort of bit in the jigsaw which convinced her. But because she hadn't gone with him to Milan, there was this feeling that he had to make it up for her. So he said, I'm due to play in Florida in the summer, and I will take you with me then.
It was probably something that they talked about and planned for about 6 to 8 weeks, I think, beforehand, about where they would go and what they would stay, where they would stay, and what they would hope to do whilst they were there. So I think she was certainly looking forward to this trip, and Brian was telling her that it would, of course, all be funded in the main by his sponsorship.
Obviously, at that point, things were getting a little bit out of hand, and he must have, at that point, been trying to figure out how he was going to pull it off.
Brian had told probably one too many lies to Amal. He then had to find a way of making that happen.
I think this goes to the development of his fantasy life, and what is interesting about him is it seemed to be a pretty rapid escalation in terms of his fantasies. He's getting more and more detached from the reality of his life and true situation, and so that within a relatively short time he's into a situation where he's going to do anything he can to avoid detection, people finding out what he's doing, but of course his parents see through it very easily because he's totally dependent on them.
Brian Blackwell desperately needed money to fund the luxury trip he'd promised Amal, but his parents were about to put a stop to his extravagant spending. On Sunday, July the 25th, 2004, things were about to come to a head between Brian and his parents. It began with a trip Brian and his father made to the tennis club that afternoon.
A number of witnesses who were present that Sunday afternoon, those witnesses are probably the last persons ever to see Brian Blackwell Sr. alive again. Records demonstrate that sometime after 11 o'clock on that Sunday morning, he booked 2 tickets from Manchester to New York, to JFK Airport. Those tickets were for himself and Amal. They were particularly expensive tickets. I think they were business class. Certainly the cost of those was between £4,000 and £5,000, a sum of money that Brian Blackwell simply did not have access to, but a sum of money that could easily be met on his father's credit card. And in fact, that was how those flights were paid for.
His parents find out about it, and they find out that Brian's promised this holiday to Amal and put the foot down and say that he's not going to go. Now, this is a great challenge to Brian, because up until this point, everything that Brian's been able to say to Amal, he's been able to deliver on. He said, "I'll buy you a car," and he bought her a car. It arrived on the doorstep. He said he'd buy Amal a diamond ring, and she got a ring even though it wasn't diamond. So all the fantasies that Brian had lived out up until this point hadn't been challenged. When we're left in a situation where his parents challenge his authority or his ability to go to America, how's he going to get out of the situation? There's a great loss of face or a loss of self-esteem. He's embarrassed.
It's very difficult to be accurate as to precisely what took place that fateful early evening, because the only person still alive who can tell us what happened is Brian Blackwell, and he is such a practiced liar and deceiver that very little store can be set by what he said. I suspect probably what must have happened is that he reached the point of no return with his parents. They were onto his spending. They'd clearly been rows in the past about his spending, and Brian must have been pushed into a corner in his own mind, and at that stage matters took the most dreadful turn. Thereafter, it's obvious that there was a row between Brian and his parents.
Brian Blackwell hit his 71-year-old father over the head with a claw hammer and stabbed him 30 times with a 10-inch carving knife. He then knocked his 61-year-old mother unconscious with the hammer before stabbing her in the head and chest around 20 times.
Having killed his parents, Brian later described burning the clothing that he'd been wearing in an incinerator in the garden. Amal was waiting for him to turn up at the house and had actually rung him on a couple of occasions, and a taxi had called outside the long driveway, which he hadn't come out to, so she then arranged for another taxi, and he left.
In fact, at one point, he pretended to go back into the house to say goodbye, in the full knowledge that he'd left the body of his parents there. He then went to Amal's house, and it was noticeable that in the course of the journey from Melling to Amal's house, the taxi driver didn't detect any signs of the traumatic event to which Brian had recently been involved. In fact, he said it was a perfectly normal conversation, which is a rather surprising feature and a rather chilling feature.
The following day, they flew to New York. They flew business class for tickets just under £5,000. They stayed at one of the better hotels in New York and then flew on to Miami and Barbados and had a very expensive holiday. It was clear now that money was no object to Brian. It seems almost beyond belief that any person, particularly a person who is only fairly young and not that worldly wise, could put aside the events that he'd left back at home, which were horrific, and be able to separate them from his holiday. It takes a certain sort of person, I think, that is able to do that. And it was certainly something he was able to achieve, to the extent that Amal had no idea whatsoever that he was carrying this, what anybody else would describe as a huge burden on himself.
When Brian Blackwell and Amal Saba landed in New York, Brian had arranged for a limousine to meet them and take them to one of the city's most luxurious hotels, the Plaza. He booked one of its top suites overlooking Central Park. All the time, Amal was completely unaware of the horrific crime Brian had committed. In this chilling video clip, Brian is clearly seen to be having a great time with Amal, enjoying the luxury surroundings just days after killing his parents.
Let's show you the bathroom with our own little television, shower,
And jacuzzi.
And we have our own little dressing table. That's me, hello.
And that's me.
And this is our view at night. Don't know if you can see anything.
Here she was in this, it's like an apartment. It's the presidential suite. It's where Kennedy stays and Bush stays. And Brian then ordered a meal of lobster and oysters and caviar. So it must have been very romantic. And he said that she could go to Prada or Gucci or wherever she wanted in Fifth Avenue in the morning and buy whatever she wanted.
They stayed in very top hotels, hundreds of pounds a night. They ate and drank lavishly, the finest champagne, lobsters. We actually recovered a bill from one of the hotels. It was an extremely expensive dinner. There was absolutely no expense spared on this trip. And certainly Amal must have been dazzled by the ability that this young man had to spend money.
It's a curious feature that she didn't seem to be concerned that there was no tennis, but it may well have been that, in fact, that was another lie told by Brian.
They toured North America, going in no particular order to San Francisco, Miami, and to Barbados. The pretext of the trip, of course, was that Brian would be playing a tennis tournament in Miami, but he had to tell Amal that he couldn't play because the weather didn't suit it, and that's why the tournament was cancelled.
They enjoyed a very, very good lifestyle. A lifestyle, no doubt, in keeping with the vision that Brian had of himself as an international tennis player. At no stage did Amal have any clue that there was anything wrong with Brian's parents. On occasions, he pretended to get in touch with his parents. We've been able to recover the photographs that they took of the trip, and viewing those photographs, they're happy, they're smiling in all the various locations, and freed from perhaps the constraints of his parents. He made full use of it, he made full use of the cards, and he spent a vast amount of money in the course of those 2 weeks or so.
She said that there was never at any point any sense that he was under stress, distressed, nervous, anxious. So they had a whistle-stop tour of the high spots of America with no indication whatsoever of what he'd left behind, of the horror that he'd left behind.
Teenager Brian Blackwell has just enjoyed a £30,000 holiday of a lifetime to America with girlfriend Amal Saba. He'd used his dead parents' credit cards to pay for the trip after killing them and leaving their bodies to rot at their home in Melling, Liverpool. With his unsuspecting girlfriend, Brian returns to the scene of the killings.
When Brian came back from America, he went straight back to his home. I personally think at this point he expected to see police activity around the house.
They were met by a neighbour who expressed some surprise that they didn't know Mr. and Mrs. Blackwell had gone to Spain. At that stage, it presented Brian with another opportunity to lie his way out of difficulty.
I went in that particular morning to pick the letters up, and I noticed his girlfriend was in front of the bungalow, and there was luggage on the floor. And I was amazed. I thought, oh, well, perhaps they've all come back. And I said, is Brian's mother and father back? And she said, we haven't been with them. She said, we've been separate. We've been to New York, and they've gone to Spain. And then she shouted to Brian. He said, there's a neighbour here. Then he came back. He came from the side of the bungalow, and he said, oh, hello, Gordon, you know. And I said, oh, hello, Brian. He said, I've just come to pick your letters up. He said, oh. And I mentioned the mother and father, and he said they hadn't come back. And he couldn't get in the bungalow, he said, because he hadn't got a key.
He recovered the car from a garage, and he was invited to stay with Amal, which of course would have been fitted in, I think, with what he hoped she would ask him to do.
Brian did keep going back to the house, and sometimes he went with her, and she recalls him playing tennis against the back wall. She recalls him going into his father's stash of wine to bring some out to give to her mother as a thank you for having him. And he was behaving in basically a completely ordinary way. Later on, what we did find, and quite unbelievably, was that Brian, in actual fact, had gone back and gone into the house himself. This was several weeks now after the bodies had been left there, and there was a great deal of decomposition of the bodies, and it was a fairly horrific scene. But Brian had gone back to the house and recovered certain photographs that he wanted, and also some posts that he felt that he would need. So he'd actually been into the house while the bodies were there in a very poor state.
He ignored their presence. He was unable to look at either his mum and dad, and he took some family mementos together with the hammer which had been used to strike his father, which peculiarly he kept.
Brian Blackwell carried on as if nothing had happened. On August the 19th, 2004, more than 3 weeks after the killings, he picked up his long-awaited exam results.
On A-level day, when Brian came in to pick up his A-levels, he was very much like many of the other students who were there on that day. Seemed to be happy and excited by the results that he'd received. He'd achieved straight A grades, so obviously he was going on to where he hoped to go to. And when I spoke to him, he seemed to be normally happy, rather like the rest of the students on the day.
Indeed, rather cruelly, when the day came for him to receive his A-level results, he complained that his parents had in some way let him down by not being there for when the results came. And of course only Brian knew that his parents were in no position to join in his success on that day. Brian had a problem because he knew that the bodies of his parents still lay in the house undetected, and the longer that went on, the greater the problem was going to be. And at one stage he actually went into Kirby, which is quite close to his parents' property, and he approached two young men, offered them money to burn the house down. Again, he must have thought in his own mind that that was a perfectly proper thing to do. It was a way of getting rid of the problem. But so arrogant was he that he never gave any thought to the rather curious figure he would cut on the streets of Kirby. He stood out straight away from the way he was dressed, the way he spoke, as not being a local. And in fact, the two lads that he spoke to, one of them thought he was an undercover police officer. He told them that he wanted a house burnt down. He told them that the house belonged to a drug dealer, and he'd had difficulties with the drug dealer, and he wanted revenge. At no stage did either of those two lads believe there was any truth whatsoever in the deal that Brian was putting to them.
Thinking the Blackwells were on holiday at their villa in Spain, Neighbour Pete Boyle became concerned at the build-up of mail in the front porch, which had been left open. He decided to go to his neighbour's house and post the mail through the letterbox.
And it was only then when I picked up the mail and I lifted the flap up, which was obviously an airtight flap, and the smell came out. And it was when I stepped back and I looked at the door, and it was strange really, because we hadn't neither my daughter or I, we hadn't noticed it when we were walking up. But inside of the door was covered in flies. We stepped back and looked at the rest of the house, and the windows on either side, they were also covered, absolutely covered in flies. We went to the kitchen window and looked through that window to see if we could see anything. The floor, I'd never been in their house, and I assumed it had black vinyl, like, until I noticed it was actually moving. The whole floor was literally covered in flies and blue bottles. And we noticed more flies on the other window, and I said to my daughter, I said, well, we have to go back, we'll have to get in touch with the police, there's something wrong. So we phoned the police, and they came within about 20 minutes.
They gained entry to the house, which looked like there also may have been a burglary as well, because of a broken glass round to the side of the house. The police gained entry and immediately realised that they were in a crime scene. They didn't advance very further because it was clear that the occupants of the house were dead.
They were met with a very disturbing scene. The bodies were left exactly where they'd fallen some six weeks earlier.
A murder hunt has been launched on Merseyside after an elderly couple were found dead at their home. They were found in Melling. Police say their bodies were heavily decomposed.
What they found was two bodies that they thought at first had been shot, and certainly that's the information that I was given, that there appeared to be signs of a burglary and the occupants had been shot, which of course gives a whole different impression about what actually has taken place. But the state of the bodies was such that they were unable, just on a visual check, to establish what the cause of death was, and we'd have to wait a couple of days later for the post-mortem findings of that.
The police were keen to find Brian Blackwell to tell him of his parents' deaths. They tracked him down to his girlfriend Amal Saba's house, where he'd been staying since they returned from America more than 3 weeks before.
I sent 2 officers out to that address, and shortly afterwards Brian arrived in the car that we'd been looking for. They went into the house, which is Amal's home, where Amal and her mother were, and they broke the news to Brian that his parents had been found in the house and were both dead. He reacted like you would expect from somebody who'd been given such awful news. He was stunned and then became very upset about what had taken place, but then felt that it couldn't be them because they were in Spain.
The police wanted to speak to Brian because they knew from inquiries that he was likely to have been the last person to have seen his parents. To that extent, he wasn't a suspect initially, but as soon as the police arrived at Amal's house and spoke to him, they obviously suspected that he knew a lot more than he was initially telling them.
My suspicions had fallen on Brian quite early on, but it was something he said that really confirmed those suspicions when he spoke to one of the officers and quite out of context asked him if prison was cold. At that point, I decided that Brian was to be arrested for the murder of his parents. As time was going on with the interviews, that Brian was gaining in confidence and becoming more sure of himself. It was a tactic of ours that in the initial parts of the interview, we would simply ask Brian. Brian would simply be asked for his explanation, his whereabouts, and his account of what had gone on over the weeks, and that little, or if any, challenge was going to be made to anything that he said.
It was very curious. He didn't necessarily exhibit the signs that one might expect of a young man whose parents had been so brutally slain in their own home. One gets the impression that he felt he could almost lie his way out of trouble, even at that stage, even in the police station. And there's a suggestion that he probably felt that he was cleverer in some way than those interviewing him.
I'm here, obviously, because the police suspect me for doing this. I've been asked a number of but I consider to be slightly relevant questions. I believe that should be done more as a witness rather than a suspect. The reason I was arrested was because I admitted to going to the house. There's other people who have been up to the house, so obviously in my mind I'm wondering why they haven't been arrested. But I think I've proven that I've not been here when it's happened. And obviously, if I wasn't here to do it, then I shouldn't be held.
While Brian Blackwell was being interviewed, police were carrying out round-the-clock searches of the Blackwells and Amal's house for evidence which would lead them to the killer.
It was during the course of one of those evenings that a bag was found which belonged to Brian, that had actually been they'd asked him to put into the garage because it somewhat smelt. They opened the bag and in it was found a hammer, but more importantly a set of keys to the house. Now, Brian had always maintained throughout that he couldn't have gained access to the house because he didn't have keys for it, and that he'd been locked out of the house and therefore couldn't go in.
The finding of the keys, or putting of this information to Brian, was a significant point in the interview because the police were able to demonstrate to Brian that the account that he'd given to them simply wasn't true up until this point.
Now is the time also to change our interview tactics and, more importantly, our interview team, because I wanted Brian to consider this important piece of evidence, being unfamiliar with the people who were talking to him. He was then interviewed by two different people, and during the course of that, Brian then confessed.
I had, during the day, been putting up pictures on my wall. I'd just come into the lounge and started having a discussion. It got to a violent stage in the arguments with my dad, where I obviously felt under pressure enough to push back, and I struck him with the soft side of the hammer. You know, the part you hammer a nail in with. It knocked him back slightly. It was a split reaction. My mum was in the kitchen, obviously heard the commotion and everything. She came in with a carving knife up in a stabbing motion, obviously for self-defense. I swung more than anything, swung the hammer just to get myself free. I'm not sure who exactly I've struck, where, how many times or anything. And I remember I did take the knife. I just remember my dad lying in his seat. And there was some blood coming up. My mum said, "What did you do, Boo?"
Brian Blackwell Sr. and his wife Jacqueline have been stabbed and bludgeoned to death by their teenage son, Brian. After confessing to the horrific crime, Brian claims he killed his doting parents during a violent row. But police forensics give a very different picture of what happened on that fateful day.
Brian Blackwell Sr. had sustained massive head injuries consistent with being struck repeatedly with a hammer or other similar object. He had several stab wounds to the left side of his face. He'd suffered stab wounds to the upper chest, and significantly, he'd suffered stab wounds, slash wounds to his arms and hands. And the forensic science opinion was that, and indeed the pathologist's opinion, was that those marks on Brian Blackwell Sr.'s hands and arms were entirely consistent with defensive injuries. So it's apparent that he was the subject of a savage and violent attack whilst he was sat in the chair. There is no evidence whatsoever of any other struggle taking place in that room. There was no upturned furniture. There was nothing broken. There was no evidence at all of any kind of fight or other physical altercation that was in any way consistent with what Brian had alleged.
I spoke to him for a bit and told him I still loved him. I probably believed what I'd done. I saw my mum and she seemed alive.
When you say she seemed...
She didn't look cold or like a dead person. I thought she may still be alive. But for some reason I can't honestly explain, I pulled into the bathroom. I think I splashed some water that I asked him to come back.
It's very difficult to say what sort of remorse he actually demonstrated, because certainly they found that he was a fairly manipulative sort of young man who was able to put on whatever face seemed to be acceptable to the events. Yes, he became upset, but whether that was true remorse, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure it was.
The thing was, though, I didn't think that the blade I didn't think the blade had particularly gone in deep, because I don't know how easily a blade goes into somebody, but it was just short jabs. It's probably the blade was about an inch away from him each time. And with my mum, and I couldn't see it because he was very close. I thought it was barely. But I couldn't believe that someone would die so easily. It seemed like just a bit of commotion. I couldn't believe that someone would have died so easily from that.
2 days after his arrest, Brian Blackwell was charged with the murder of his parents. The people closest to Brian couldn't believe this intelligent, quiet and polite young man could be responsible for such a brutal crime.
It's an awful cliche, and I don't know how many people say it in tragic circumstances, but he really was the last person you would associate with something like this.
Brian Blackwell had written to his ex-girlfriend Amal from prison, begging to see her. After first refusing, she decided to confront him face to face.
The thing which shocked her the most to the core was the fact that A, he could have lied to her like that, and B, she could have believed it. So when she went to see him in prison, that was what she was asking him over and over again. And she describes him as still being in denial. Like him, her coping mechanism is a kind of denial. And there are, I think, underneath that, feelings of guilt that she didn't see the warning signs when she could have done.
The case was always presented and prepared as one of murder. There were sufficient inconsistencies and lies told by Brian Blackwell with his dealings with his family, with the banks, that would enable us to present this as somebody who killed his parents for reasons of financial greed.
But prosecutors were faced with a surprise twist when they received the psychiatric reports. The reports concluded that Brian was suffering from NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, which made him obsessed with fantasies of success, power and brilliance. They said the brutal killings were the result of a narcissistic rage, not premeditated murder.
It is an unusual case because normally one would not accept a plea to diminish responsibility, but perhaps put all the evidence before the jury and invite them to make their mind up. But this was a case where just before the trial started, all the evidence was pointing towards the fact that Brian Blackwell was suffering from this particularly severe form of NPD, and it would have been entirely inappropriate to prosecute him for murder in the full knowledge that the experts who would have given evidence in the trial would have come to the same conclusion.
We ultimately don't know what prompted him to kill his parents. There are possibilities which might fit in with his narcissistic personality. The first is that somehow or other the fantasy life that he created collapsed like a house of cards. He was going on holiday. He intended to spend a large amount of money. His parents were not going to permit this. And that this caused such an outburst of rage in him that he became murderously angry and killed his parents at that stage. There is, of course, an alternative possibility, and that would tend to indicate that his personality disorder is actually even more severe than most of the cases that one usually encounters. And that's that he was utterly callous, that this was planned, and that he effectively just dispatched his parents because they stood in his way.
But at Liverpool Crown Court, the judge and prosecution team accepted Brian's guilty plea to 2 counts of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. It meant Brian Blackwell would not have to face trial by jury.
It's very easy to misjudge these killings and to assume what Brian did was cold and calculated, and in fact all the evidence points to it being precisely the opposite. The prosecution with all their experience, a very senior judge would not have accepted that manslaughter was the appropriate plea unless they were persuaded by a great weight of medical evidence that Brian was suffering from narcissism.
During his court hearing, Brian Blackwell made efforts to show his remorse and how he was facing up to the enormity of the atrocities he'd committed.
He read a letter out at court, and during the course of the letter he talked about the options he'd taken in hospital for anger management and coming to terms with what he'd done. But in actual fact, it is exactly what the psychologists predict that he would do, that he would become, as he probably was when free, he would become a model prisoner just as he was a model son. And that would be very difficult for them to distinguish about a genuine attempt to rehabilitate himself and an attempt in actual fact to defraud the parole system.
Sentencing him to life, the judge said Blackwell had shown breathtaking callousness in his chilling crime. He told him, "For a son to do this is almost beyond belief. But you are no ordinary son."
What, of course, the judge did do was take account of Brian's age, and he took properly into account that this is a plea to manslaughter rather than murder, and the life sentence was discretionary rather than mandatory. So at the same time, Brian is eligible to apply for parole in 5.5 years' time. And that's a reasonably short period, because it reflects that should he make significant and sufficient progress whilst he's in custody, and once he's assessed by experienced psychiatrists, if he poses no danger to the public, then there's no reason at all why he shouldn't be released in 5 or 6 years' time.
Whether his expectations are that he will be released, I think that's probably something he's actually quite realistic about. That the chances are that, if ever, it will be a long, long time in the future.
And I'm all mixed up, feeling cornered and rushed. They say it's my fault, but I want it so much. Wanna fly around.